Now, before we begin, I want to acknowledge the presence of Jill Abramson, the managing editor of the New York Times, and it's honored to have her here. And I have a few copies of her two books. Her book, Where Are They Now? The Story of the Women of Harvard Law, 1974, and Strange Justice, The Selling of Clarence Thomas. Now, Jill will interview Maureen, and then Maureen will take some questions. But before they do that, I have a brief introduction that I want to get to. I want to acknowledge the presence of Ashley Parker, editorial assistant of Maureen Dowd, who also has written some wonderful articles in the New York Times. She's sitting back here. I may as well embarrass you, Ashley. Maureen Dowd was born in Washington, D.C., received a BA in English from Catholic University in 1973, then began her distinguished career at the Washington Star. From there, she went to Time magazine, then moved to the New York Times in 1986 as a Washington correspondent. She has covered 6 presidential campaigns and served as a White House correspondent. She also wrote the On Washington column for the New York Times magazine. In 1995, she became a columnist for the New York Times op-ed page. She's the only female op-ed columnist. Received a Pulitzer Prize in 1999 for distinguished commentary, and is the author of the best-selling Bush World, Enter at Your Own Risk. Her other writings have appeared in Time, GQ, Harper's Bazaar, Mademoiselle, Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, Ladies' Home Journal, Sports Illustrated, The New Republic, and Redbook, among many other publications. As Maureen is here this evening to discuss her new book, Are Men Necessary When Sexes Collide?, I wish to draw your attention briefly to some of her mentors and influences who are discussed in the book. Helen Gurley Brown, publisher and editor-in-chief of Cosmopolitan magazine; Katharine Graham, publisher of the Washington Post; Mary McGrory, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the Washington Star and the Washington Post; and Peggy Minahan Dowd, the Under the Capitol Dome columnist for the National Hibernian Digest. Peggy Dowd, incidentally, would write to any member of Congress who made what she considered the cardinal sin of referring to Edmund Burke as a British rather than Irish statesman. When mother and daughter attended the 1990 White House Christmas party and President George Herbert Walker Bush gave Mom a kiss, she said to her daughter in a steely voice, "I don't ever want you to be mean to that man again." Known by the White House as Cobra and as the flame-haired flamethrower, it is our great privilege and honor to present the foremost metaphor maven of our time and sexiest patriot in America, Maureen Dowd.
I just want to apologize for being late. I've never been here before. I've always wanted to see La Jolla, but we thought it was a 2-hour drive, and it turned out to be a 3. But I have brought Jill Abramson, so as Hillary used to say, you're getting 2 for the price of 1. And any questions you have, in a little while about current events or the Times or anything you want, we will endeavor to answer. And I thought it might be fun if she just asked me a few questions, and then we'll throw it open to you guys, and you can ask both of us anything, and we'll try to entertain you for as long as you like.
Some people at the Times call me and Maureen the Thelma and Louise of newspaper journalism, and throttling down the freeway here, it felt like a Thelma and Louise road trip. Really apologize to all of you that we're a little bit late. I thought it would be fun I love this book by Maureen for a huge number of reasons, and it has such currency in terms of what's going on right now today. And so I couldn't resist. I thought it would be fun to begin by asking her. In the past week, we've had this tremendous kind of fight that was spurred by President Clinton's interview on Fox News over who deserves the blame for not paying enough attention to the Al-Qaeda threat. And at the midweek point, we had Condi weighing in to defend W, and then Hillary rushing in and to the defense of my husband, as she put it. So My first question for you, Maureen, is why does the country seem to be thirsting for a Hillary Condi catfight, and what is that all about?
I think that when feminism dawned, when I was in high school in the late 60s, there were many things that the early feminists thought would be a thing of the past by the year 2006. One was the term Mrs., which Gloria Steinem spent 20 years trying to get rid of at the New York Times. And in 1986, the day that Abe Rosenthal agreed to do it, she sent him a bouquet of flowers. I was there as a cub reporter and saw the flowers come. But nowadays, young girls love the term Mrs. You know, it's considered one of the ultimate status symbols in American society, along with dermatology appointments and plastic surgery appointments. So another thing that we thought would not exist in the future, in the first flush of sisterhood, was the whole notion of catfights. But as it turns out, catfights are very profitable. So even a lot of women push them, like women who own tabloids or who are editors of tabloids or television shows like Desperate Housewives. And the actresses on Desperate Housewives intentionally play up the catfights because it's going to make them a lot of money. So it's an economic thing that drives catfights. Now, in the case of Condi and Hillary, I get asked about this almost more than anything because everyone is really fascinated with them because, as I say in the book, they don't throw like girls. They are relentless. I mean, men cry all the time now. George Allen was misting up with Wolf Blitzer the other day because he was talking about, finding his Jewish heritage after a lifetime of being a Southern redneck. With a Confederate flag and a noose in his office, actually true, a lynching noose. And W can mist up, and his father would cry a lot when I covered him, but women still cannot cry, and Hillary and Condi don't cry. They, whether you agree with them or not, and there's a lot I don't agree with each of them, you have to admire that they just keep coming, and they do it in a very forceful way. But nevertheless, the other day when, Clinton did this finger wagging thing with Chris Wallace, which I think was intentional, because with the Clintons, there's always a 3-bag shot involved. And I think this was his way with Hillary. I bet they planned it together in Chappaqua while they watched Grey's Anatomy, which I found out they do every Sunday. They just want to put people on notice that she is not going to be swift voted. And they are going to fight back. And so I think that was, a shot across the bow of Fox. And then she jumped in, but the New York Post immediately focused on Condi and Hillary angle and had it as a catfight on the cover of the New York Post. So, it's a wonderful kind of example of how all these different gender things. I mean, if Hillary wins, Bill Clinton will be our first lad, which I personally am salivating for. I think he would have the time of his life, and it would be so much fun to cover him. But I think, because the first story when he won the presidency was Hillary wants West Wing office and Bill's going to give it to her. And the first story if Hillary wins is Bill wants West Wing office and Hillary isn't going to give it to him. So I think it would be really fun. So that's a long answer to the catfight question, but.
Maureen and I first kind of got to know each other. We sat across the press table from each other during the famous Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill hearings. And at the point in this Rococo Senate hearing room when the words, "Who put this pubic hair on my Coke can?" was uttered in the Senate. I mean, both of us looked at each other and our jaws dropped. But in your book, you write a little bit, you revisit some of the great sort of gender-related political stories, Geraldine Ferraro being chosen to be on the ticket as the first woman, and the colossal sort of male senators not getting the issue of sexual harassment in the Anita Hill case. And I wondered whether those cases still reverberate and have any lessons for what's going on today as we're revving up for yet another little congressional sex scandal, although this one doesn't appear to involve women yet, but we'll see.
It's funny because my last chapter, which I'm really proud of, I realized it took me a few decades to realize this, but I realized I had covered all the great kind of sexual scandals in modern Washington history, and that in each of them, I, like other women, were kind of very excited at first when we chose Ferraro and when Anita Hill came forward, and when Hillary was 2 for the price of 1. But all of these things turned out to have a backlash against women. And so, I write in the book that, feminism lasted a nanosecond and the backlash has lasted 40 years. And so I trace it through, and I say at the beginning of the chapter, there's a good reason why the Washington Monument is the premier symbol of Washington. And some of these things, you never escape from. I was just reading the paper on the way here, and there's a New York politician in this case of Jeannie Pirro, which I don't know if you followed, but she is being accused of thinking of taping her husband, who she was afraid was being unfaithful, and her whole political career is kind of going up in smoke. And, a male politician was trying to defend her, and he goes, well, this is her husband. This is just what men do. This is just what they do. It's nothing. He just was having a little affair at the country club or something. We shouldn't get too excited. But it's fun to look at all the sexual scandals and how they, again, with Anita Hill, I think that everyone thought that men in the Senate would be incredibly sensitized and everything would change. And now Jill is dealing with our lead of the paper tomorrow, which is a Republican congressman named Mark Foley, who has been caught sending salacious emails to male pages on Capitol Hill. And what our reporter was describing as electronic masturbation. So Washington and sex, you're never going to get around that.
The two of us are, among a still fairly small number of women at the top of the New York Times. Maureen is, of course, our only woman columnist, and in the galaxy of political columnists at all publications, she's one of the few, really strong female voices. And whether it's journalism or, we've been following with rapt attention the downfall of Patricia, Dunn at Hewlett-Packard. She succeeded Carly at Hewlett-Packard, and for a while they were, among the very few women CEOs in the business world. Are you still surprised that there are relatively few women at the top? And in your trade, which is opinion, politically related columns, why are there so few women out there still, do you think?
I have a chapter on this in the book. It's, I had a really hard time becoming morphine into an opinion columnist and having instant opinions. And I try to analyze it in the book. And, it seems unjustifiable when you think about it, that the Times only has 1 out of 9 as a woman. But one of my girlfriends, who is the deputy Outlook editor at the Washington Post, did a wonderful piece on this. And she said she spends a lot of time trying to persuade women to do opinion pieces, and she'll call them and they'll be like, yeah, I really need a few days to think that through, or I've got to take my kids to a soccer game, let me get back to you in a couple days. And she said whenever she calls men to do an op-ed piece, they're like, oh, fine, I'll cancel the family vacation, you'll have the piece right in the morning. And that they know exactly what they want to say, and they will not let anything get in the way. And women are just much more handle it much more differently. So there are more male bloggers, there are more male TV shouters, there are more teenage boys who trash talk on the basketball court. I just think that I've interviewed, people who are experts in myth and folklorists. The famous one, Alan Dundee's at the University of Berkeley, and he says that men are just used to the art of verbal dueling. But when a woman starts it, there's a visceral reaction like, get back to the kitchen. We don't want to hear what you have to say about this. And I do think the reaction to a woman criticizing men in power is much more personal. It's like very sharp. They get very angry at me. Whereas when a guy does it, it's like, well, that's his job. Okay. But I don't want that to sound like whining. I'm just saying there are gender differences which prevent women from doing it with as much alacrity, perhaps, but that doesn't mean you can't recruit harder and get them. But what Jill mentioned is really fascinating. I don't have this in the book because it just happened, but it's just really fascinating to look at Hillary Clinton's change in her management style and at the Hewlett-Packard thing, because Hillary Clinton started out on healthcare almost with a very alpha male management style. You could almost say Cheney-esque. It was like she failed because it was my way or the highway. She didn't have any of the softer, her husband tried to step in sometimes and take some of the congressmen involved to golf and a beer and schmooze them, but then she'd meet with them and she'd say, no, you've got to do it my way, and the whole deal would fall apart again. And she wasn't listening, and it was very secretive. And then when she got to the Senate, she took all of those lessons and she has completely changed. But what's interesting is she's using ancient feminine wiles that have worked for women with men through centuries. She is fetching older male senators coffee, like she used to fetch Strom Thurmond his coffee, and she will step back and make sure they can get in the forefront of pictures so that their egos can be flattered. And a lot of, with Robert Byrd, she went and flattered him and said, oh, you have to run a class in parliamentary tactics for the freshmen. And then she brought, and he is renowned for making these really boring speeches on the Senate floor about Mother's Day. And so one day she brought her mother by his office and said, oh, my mother wants to tell you how much she loves your Mother's Day speeches. And the guy will do anything. When she called him and said, we need money for New York after 9/11, he was like, how much? And when can I deliver it? And she goes to the prayer breakfast with conservatives, and a lot of her base gets really angry that she's doing legislation with conservatives and they feel like she's pandering, and she is on things like flag burning amendment, because how many flags are burned? It's ridiculous. But she has successfully changed her image to someone who listens and works with the other side and gets legislation through. And so she went from the alpha male approach to this sort of ancient female wiles approach. And then you look at Hewlett-Packard, and Carly Fiorina did the alpha male approach. She was sort of a bully. She didn't listen to anyone. She just rammed stuff through. She didn't bring all those qualities that you always think women are going to bring. And now we have Patricia Dunn, who is being, accused of having stereotypically feminine kind of sneaky subterfuge instead of just confronting the male board members with her suspicions that they were leaking. She went behind their back and hired someone to spy on them. So, I was interviewing a male business consultant, and they're all very sympathetic to Patricia Dunn. They say, oh, well, she couldn't get in the boys' club, and that was the only way she could do it. But at the same time, they say it's going to be a long time before Hewlett-Packard, a very progressive company, might try another woman, because they've had these two huge disasters. So to me, they're only 2%, I think, of is it 2% of Fortune 400 companies, or is it 11? 11%? 11% are run by women. And, we just got our first female news anchor. I don't know when we're going to get a female president. I think things are moving very slowly in many ways for women. And I think it's just interesting as a reporter to watch them struggle with what is the right management technique for a woman. And Hillary is running, and she's still kind of, trying to get that right. And it's just a very tricky thing. And in her case, and in Jeannie Pirro's case, they also have to worry about, are their presidents suddenly going to, are their husbands suddenly going to blow up their campaign in the middle of the campaign? So there have to be whole strategies for what happens if Bill is caught with another woman and how do they deal with that. So that's, there's just very, like everything with women, it's all very complicated, but all very fascinating.
With the Woodward book just coming out and dominating the headlines the past 2 days, I need to take you back to Bushworld, your first book. Maureen kind of singularly was onto Bushworld and had, such a fabulous take on Rummy and Cheney and the rest of the constellations surrounding President Bush. And between the NIE about how really badly everything is going in Iraq and some of the people who chose to unburden themselves at this point about dysfunction in this White House, is the view of Bushworld now different than the one that you had? Because your book, in a way, was the first. Maureen's comment has been pretty relentlessly both on target but very critical of Bushworld. But now you're starting to sixth year of this presidency really see people who were silent for a long time begin to speak out. And has it changed your picture of Bushworld, or what do you think exactly is going on? Is it imploding or not?
From the beginning, for me, I think I'm not, people who want to dispute what's in my column will say, oh, that's just psychobabble. But I'm not really so much into psychobabble, I've never been to a shrink, not that there's anything wrong with it. And I come from an Irish family, and we're all kind of very obsessively close and talk to each other about our problems. But I do think there's almost no other way to analyze this presidency except in terms of the classic father-son relationship that I have studied in Shakespeare and you see in Joseph Campbell and Star Wars. The dark father and the light father, with Cheney being Darth Vader and his own father, being the sort of lighter father. And, Woodward's book only just confirms this, because I've always wondered, why would W hire Donald Rumsfeld when Donald Rumsfeld spent so much time back in the day trying to destroy Bush Sr.'s career? That's why he recommended he be the CIA director, because he thought that would get him off track for a presidential run. And he just thought he was wimpy and flighty and a patrician and shouldn't be president. And he, Donald Rumsfeld, was the tough ex-wrestler infighter who should be president. So I was just thinking to myself, if I were president, why would I appoint a guy who really tried to hurt my dad if I really loved my dad? That just didn't make sense. And it's so interesting to see Woodward, actually come right out and say that part of the appeal of Rumsfeld to W and part of his staying appeal is the fact that, his dad thought he was an authoritarian bully who didn't listen to anyone. So W not only didn't ask his dad before he went and waged the same war with the same dictator, his dad who had spent his whole life on foreign affairs, but he was appointing people just because he thought he could prove his dad wrong, just the same way he wanted to go into Iraq just to prove he could upend his dad. And I know they love each other and everything, but the unspoken rivalry of a child, an oldest son, who drifts into his 40s and is always dwarfed by the shadow of his father, has shaped all of our lives in really deleterious ways, I think. So, Woodward, I was telling Jill this morning that when Bushworld came out, I was on the George Stephanopoulos show, and Woodward was on the panel with me, and afterwards he came in the green room, and he sat down and he said, I think your view of Bush and Cheney is way too negative. They're not that bad. So now his view has come around to my view, so I'm feeling pretty good.
Maureen would love to just answer your questions, and I know it's difficult, I know, because a lot of people are out on the curve, but if you sort of speak up, what I'll do is I'll try to repeat the question so everyone can hear it, and then have Maureen answer. Is that okay?
If you could give a précis.
Yeah, sure.
And if anybody has questions for Jill.
No.
Yes. An observation is that Washington Week has done a good job of introducing women as commentators, and in my view, an especially good group. Would you comment on that? And has that played a role? I mean, that fact played a role in further.
The question was just the show Washington Week on PBS that now has a female host, Gwen Ifill, and has been a showcase even going back to the days when Paul Duke was the moderator of trying to give prominent roles to women commentators on TV, whether it's Linda Greenhouse, who covers the Supreme Court for the Times, has been on that show, and Karen Tumulty, who covers politics for Time, and whether having that show as a showcase for women is part of a brightening trend for women on television.
Well, the funny part about this is that there have been a lot of stories coming out recently that men are vanishing in newsrooms across the country, that women are taking over. There's so many women on TV. So really, it was just what Roger Ailes calls the Mount Olympus, which is the network news anchor spot they were hesitant to give to a woman. And when I was writing my book, it was right around the time that they were thinking of giving it to Elizabeth Vargas. And I happened to run into a guy at the top of ABC Disney who would have control of this decision. And I said to him, would you think about giving it to Elizabeth Vargas? And he goes, oh, of course, Elizabeth Vargas is great. Of course, we would love to have her be the anchor. And then he paused and he goes, but what if there was another 9/11? That could be a problem. And so I said, oh, you mean you'll give it to a woman if no news breaks out? And he said, yeah. He goes, then we could bring in a guy, And it's the daddy in the chair thing, which you have as president too, especially in the era of terrorism. They're just thinking in a crisis, we need a daddy in a chair. And that's what Katie is sort of confronting, can she be the daddy in the chair, or do we need just a mommy in the chair? And in a way, this was something you saw also in the Clinton re-election campaign, when Naomi Wolf came up with the theme for Clinton, which she ran on, of the good father, it was called. The good father who protects the home from invaders. That was the subtext of his campaign, and that was before terrorism. So now that we actually have invaders trying to get into the home, and the whole, I go into this in the last chapter, and this to me is the most interesting part of the book, the way gender is the subtext of every political campaign. In every political campaign, the Republicans have been more successful if they have been able to make the Democrats seem effeminate. And it might seem so blatant that you think voters would see through it, this whole cut and run, or John Kerry's a flip-flopper. It's all like phrases meant to imply impotence. And they did the same thing with Al Gore, but it's, they operate at a visceral level, and oftentimes the Democrats are operating at this cerebral level. And that visceral level, I think, especially in the age of terrorism, is very successful. But I don't know, at the Times, I think I have a chapter in the book about how geneticists say that the Y chromosome is going to, is shedding genes kind of willy-nilly and is going to go out of business in about 100,000 years or 10 million, depending on which geneticist you listen to. And I'm thinking, so in 100,000 years, we're going to have all female columnists at the Times, and it's going to be so great.
Yeah. What made you fearless?
because I just became an American citizen 1 year ago. I'm a quick study. It only took me 40 years to become an American citizen. But I have not seen such a difficult climate in all the years that I lived here to speak out. And I feel I can easier do it now when I'm an American citizen, but maybe not. But I have found it's very difficult to be dissenting or just speak out. And when I read your column, I think that you're a very brave woman. Doesn't matter different sides or whatever, but just to have another voice. What made you, who taught you how to be fearless?
It's a great question. It's why is Maureen fearless? I'm not. I'm not fearless. I'm scared of everything. The first couple years of the column, I would just go home and curl up in a ball on the floor of my house and cry. And I used to worry. Our office is directly across the park from the White House, and when it would get dark, I would think, "Oh God, the Secret Service is going to come out and make a citizen's arrest. Something bad is going to happen." But I have to say, the benefit I had once this President Bush came in office was I come from an Irish working class family. My father was a detective who was in World War I. My mom was the most patriotic person I ever knew. She would honestly cry if I didn't wear red, white, and blue on July 4th. She would wear flag stockings and her pride in America was so palpable in the household. My brothers were in the Coast Guard. So I felt confident in my patriotism. And I felt confident. I feel that what I do for a living is really important because we are checks and balances. I don't know how to say this in a way that isn't corny, but that's why it's been such a remarkable period to go through, to see Dick Cheney and the president trying to curtail and destroy checks and balances. And so I never felt a lack of confidence in my patriotism. So when a lot of reporters were cowed by that, I can see how you're cowed by that, because it's like what I was just describing about testosterone. Like if they say that the Democrats are unmanly, that's like the worst thing the Democrats shrink from. That's why Hillary voted for the war authorization. I mean, they don't want to be called unmanly. And in the same way, reporters don't want to be seen as not patriotic. Remember after 9/11 and NBC was turning the peacock into red, white, and blue? None of us want to be unpatriotic. But my family was so patriotic, I felt like it shielded me. I mean, I know what patriotism is, and patriotism is not taking away prisoners' rights and torturing them so that then, a new John McCain can be tortured by the enemy. I mean, patriotism is not how they're defining it. So I just have to thank my family for that.
We need a question.
Back here.
That gentleman there.
I want to ask about Condoleezza Rice. I know her history and all that sort of stuff. I'm quite not a cookie question. I wanted you to say something about Condoleezza that I don't already know. Maybe can you recommend her for president and why?
The question is, can Maureen tell us something about Condi Rice that we don't already know, and whether she's up to being president? She just, by the way, I'll share this with you. She was at the UN last week in New York, and she came for about an hour talk at the New York Times. She was wearing a flame red suit and a little string of pearls, and she was tough as nails. The one I asked I waited till the end and asked her a question about whether she had any regrets about the way the Bush administration went for such a hard sell right before the war in Iraq with the WMD issue, whether in hindsight she had any regrets about that. And I was interested, she actually said she did have regrets about that. They were small ones, but it was the first time I'd ever seen her be anything less than completely certain and resolute in the rightness of the policy course that she and the president have set. And it just was interesting to me that there's a tiny little bit of daylight where she was confessing to something less than total infallibility. So tell us something we don't know about Condi.
Well, my feelings about Condi, I mean, she's an amazing character. I have very ambivalent feelings. I mean, I have to say, as a woman, I really admire her narrative arc. She's like a little girl in Birmingham. She becomes this Russian scholar and, world-class pianist and ice skater, and she is incredibly articulate, and I think she dresses perfectly in a way that reflects well in the country. She deals with these Arab leaders who are racist and, anti-female in an amazingly, great way. But Condoleezza Rice, pushed an immoral case for war, and her articulateness was used to bad purposes. She blew off her mentors, Brent Scowcroft and Colin Powell. She saw which way the wind was blowing and decided to cast her lot with Cheney and Rumsfeld and W. She didn't do her job as national security advisor because she was too busy being Bush's foreign policy nanny, trying to get him up to speed on what he should have known before he was elected president. And blew off, and in Woodward's book it's confirmed again, she blew off all the warnings about terrorism because she was obsessed with missile defense and she was busy trying to teach, Bush things that he should have known. So, I'm ambivalent. I mean, yes, she cuts a great kind of impressive figure as a woman, and she's a winner. She knew which side was the winning side, and yet, because of that lie at the start where they ginned up reasons, she tamped down all the reports she saw warning that things would not be good and that, the tubes were not being used for nuclear stuff, and helped Bush play up the stuff that turned out to be exaggerated and not true. And our kids are dying now. They're just sitting ducks. So I can't admire what she did to get this country into war. So
Yeah.
I have a question about Laura Bush. I read something today about, going back to the Woodward book, they said that she recommended that the president fire Donald Rumsfeld. And I was kind of surprised by that. I want to know if you were surprised by that and kind of what your take on Laura Bush.
The question is that in the Woodward book, he reports that there were two points where Andy Card pushed to get rid of Rumsfeld, and that in the second attempt he had the support of Laura Bush. In news articles today, she seemed to be denying that was so, but it's often very difficult to ferret out exactly where Laura stands on several issues. And the question is, what's your take? How do you explain Laura's role in the White House? And do you think it's likely that she did push to get rid of Rumsfeld?
Well, in many ways, I kind of admire Laura Bush because I think, comes across as a very classy woman, and she reads, and she's forcing Bush to read Camus and Shakespeare. Which, if he won't read histories of the Middle East and learn who the Shiites and Sunnis are, I think Shakespeare is your next best bet. But, so I would tend to believe that she was smart enough. She's smart. I tend to believe that she was smart enough. Any woman who reads Russian literature knows a character like Rummy when she sees one. And I'm sure she felt like Nancy Reagan did about Don Regan, that this guy has an ego so big that he is willing to hurt, the presidency just to make his point. I know, is anyone familiar with literature, she can see that, and I'm sure she did weigh in. But her husband, said recently, I think, to some conservative columnists that he really admires Dick Cheney and Rummy's balls. And it comes back to this macho thing. He admires in them what everyone else thinks is just blowing up the world, this excessive sort of belligerence with no sense to it. And I'm not anti-war. I was in favor of going into Afghanistan if we are after real enemies who have declared war on us. But that isn't what happened with Iraq. That was Dick Cheney thinking that if he kicks some Arab butt, they wouldn't look at us cross-eyed again. And every other reason for that war was pasted on afterwards.
There's a question from San Diego City Attorney Micah Geary.
Thank you. Yourself in terms of what influences you, what you read, how you spend your day, how much time you devote to your column, and then how you spend the rest of your time?
Wow.
Can you give a précis of Mike's question?
Oh, he was just asking what I read and how I spend my time, which sounds like it might be boring for you guys.
No. We'd like to hear it.
Well, lately I've been reading, this is why it's funny to me that when Bush's reading list came out, there weren't more books like this, but I'm just desperately trying to keep up with all the books, The Looming Tower by Lawrence Wright, which explains the whole Al-Qaeda thing, and Fiasco by Tom Ricks at the Washington Post, who's a fantastic reporter. And my friend Michael Isikoff has just done Hubris, and now, I got a copy of Woodward's book with Dennis's help, which I'm going to read on the plane. And I've been reading books by soldiers, who have been in Iraq to try and figure out what it's like there, because our reporters are so circumscribed and pinioned that it's really hard to tell exactly what the situation is. So I think we were all taken to a place that, for me anyway, most of my knowledge about that part of the world came from Lawrence of Arabia, which you could learn a lot from. I wish Bush would screen that. But so I think, like all other Americans, I'm trying to learn about this thicket and trellis of tribal and religious jealousies going back centuries, and how this is affecting us. We're going to be there for a generation. And I feel like I'm in a remedial college course, trying to learn Middle East history. And I'm not a foreign affairs writer. I was sort of taken into it. In Bush World, I wrote about what I called the Ocean's 9/11 heist of the neocons by half a century of American foreign policy. And that was the part that fascinated me, how they were able to kind of get that away from the president, who was a little bit naive and just didn't know enough about foreign policy to stop them. And so then they took us to the Middle East. So now I'm trying to catch up and learn about Osama, although, again, I'll never understand why we didn't go after Osama. That to me seemed the key thing where we went off the rails.
Is there a question from outside, maybe? Sir?
Could I ask you both as journalists to say something about the precarious nature of fact in today's society? I'm talking about that famous comment about the reality-based community.
Right.
Yeah.
And, in Maureen's column today, she mentioned all these books that you just mentioned again. And my question is, so what? If they're just not going to listen to fact and go over everybody's head,
Right. The question, it's a huge one, is what has happened to fact? And the questioner cited, it actually comes from a New York Times magazine piece right before the 2004 election that Ron Suskind, who also recently wrote a very powerful book about the administration, he quoted a senior Bush White House official basically saying to Ron, a journalist, like, you in the reality-based community think that, you can hold us to account, and while you're mulling and criticizing us, we just take action. While you're sitting there trying to ferret out the facts, we act. And it was a very bold quote, and a very disturbing one that the citing of this concept of a reality-based community, what other kind of community is there? So, but clearly, this is an administration that has been very adept at shaping their own reality, and they use tools, whether it's Fox News or other vehicles to amplify a message. But where do the facts have a chance of surviving? And tell us a little bit about how that White House machine works, and what your take is on we in the reality-based community.
Well, I think Reagan did this to a certain extent, but this group has brought it to a whole new level. It's unbelievable. And that's what I wrote about in Bush World. I found it really frightening that they could just say that everything, that Saddam had weapons when it was clear that this might, was just something they were using to scare people, that it was about our security. And then afterwards, all these years afterwards, they keep saying that things are going well. And that's what Woodward, belatedly is kind of now agreeing with. And he talks about 4 assessments that Rumsfeld and the president and Condi got from people they really trust, from best friends or from, their best friends or top advisors, that told them things were not going well. And yet they keep going out and telling the American people that things are going well, which just makes me really sad and crazy, because I think our kids are there dying, and unless they admit what the true state of affairs is, they can't change the battle plan. And if they, they'd rather kind of bullet through and act all macho like everything is fine, and that's why they're not firing Rummy, then admit that things are bad and change the plans so that we can get out of there. And that's still going on to this day. And it is, when historians look back, the press will be held accountable for not pushing harder. And, this administration will be held accountable for making up a reality that Americans, if they were well informed, should just be able to see through. It's not so hard to see through it. All you need to do is, I think Katrina is a great example, because in Katrina, they were trying to say everything was fine, but you could look at CNN and see things were not fine. People were dying. And so I think it's harder with Iraq, because they don't let you see the body bags coming home. We can't cover 95% of what's happening. And we keep listening to, these generals saying things are okay, although now that's starting to break up. A lot of the generals are saying things aren't okay. But I think this will go down as one of the most amazing periods of history, that they were able to create this fake Potemkin reality where everything was going fine, when everything was really, as one Bush administration person who was in Iraq put it, going to hell in a handbasket. And that was 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Yes,
We'll come back this way,
but I column this morning about Sacha Cohen. I was wondering, since I've read your column forever, but it seems like, as you said the other morning, you've become a celebrity. I mean, if you feel indebted to the incompetence and ignorance of the Bushies in any way, for supplying this material, this endless material.
The question is whether Maureen feels deeply indebted to the Bush administration for supplying such fabulous material. I mean, I covered the first Bush White House as a New York Times White House reporter, and I always felt a little sad that my trajectory in journalism reached the White House. Had put in enough years to be a White House reporter at the very moment Bush Sr. was the president, because his presidency, I wanted someone dark and interesting and twisted like Nixon or Johnson or, and I got Bush Sr., who was always, was writing stories about whether he liked broccoli, and he was taking showers with his puppies, and even his war was very kind of video game sanitized, and there just wasn't any Shakespearean grist to it. But it is a case of be careful what you wish for, because I got that with his son. And it is, to me, an amazing, mythic Shakespearean tragedy. That sometimes I can never decide which should Shakespeare be writing it or Evelyn Waugh, because it's at moments farcical and at moments, tragedy. And
I'm a citizen. So as a citizen, I get really appalled. But as a journalist, I love Rummy to death.
Someone here, yeah.
Yes, you also did a job on Clinton too, I might add.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say it's like the old line about the first time, what is it? The first time is tragedy, the second line is farce. But Clinton's thing, with Monica was much more comical. It was just ridiculous. I grew up in Washington. My brothers were pages, and I always knew that Washington was about politicians. A lot of them have affairs. It was so absurd to think you would impeach one over it. So that was like writing about farce. That was ridiculous. But, this is tragedy. But sometimes, like today, you try and just go at it in a lighter way to make a serious point. And the way in Shakespeare, the fool says all the most serious things. It's just a way to lure the reader in, to try and make them feel that you're not giving them the same old rant when maybe you're giving them the same rant, because it's so amazing. You just have to keep saying over and over again, these people are saying things are going great in Iraq, but things are not going great in Iraq.
What, you have,
Yeah.
quick.
What I wanted to ask was, one of the things that surprised me about the Woodward book was this business of Kissinger having the president's ear.
I'm glad you brought that
And
up.
I'm wondering what you make of that. It seems like he's reliving the Vietnam War.
Right.
The question is, off the Woodward book again, the book says that Henry Kissinger has been a frequent visitor to the White House to give advice on the Iraq War, and that he has been saying the only exit strategy is victory, which seems to have such odd echoes of Vietnam. And what do you make of the return of Henry the K?
It's so funny because one of my mentors here, Mary McGrory, used to have these wonderful dinner parties where she would stay up late and drink brandy and talk about politics in this incredibly brilliant way. And she would just refer to Kissinger as the war criminal. She didn't even use his name. And I just have to say that out of all the things that have amazed me in my life, the fact that the generation that came of age in Vietnam could not have learned the lesson of Vietnam and repeated it, not only in exactly the same way, it just makes me want to lunge for Cheney's throat when he goes on TV and says, how could we possibly have known that they wouldn't wear uniforms, they're not abiding by rules of war, all this stuff that they use children to throw bombs. I mean, how could we, of course we knew. We've been through this in our lifetime. And
He wasn't there.
yeah, and Kissinger, the fact that Kissinger is over at the White House, and there was, in Woodward's book, it says Kissinger gave Michael Gerson, Bush's speechwriter, something called the salted peanut memo, which was that if you, started bringing troops home, then Americans would get a taste for that and maybe want more troops brought home. So you can't bring any home, and you can't ever admit that the plan isn't good. You just have to keep going for victory. So to go through this same thing twice, where we go into a country with no cultural knowledge of that country. My colleague David Brooks, who is a really good columnist, but he had a line in a column the other day that just blew my mind, where he said, it never occurred to us that when Iraq fell, that the Iraqis wouldn't react exactly like Americans. Now, this is just crazy. We are spending $30 billion a year on intelligence, on a State Department, on people who analyze United States companies. Corporations are hiring anthropologists to tell them how to open up the market in China and how you do open up different markets. And we go into this country with such cultural obtuseness that we just assume that they're going to react like us, and we're shocked when they're fighting us without uniforms, and our kids do not have the right armor because they weren't expecting an insurgency, even though this was in all the reports that Condi ignored. So it's really heartbreaking that having gone, my favorite place in Washington to go by myself and take visitors is the Vietnam Memorial, because it is so moving. And when you see the wall going up with more and more names of dead kids, that's when McNamara and Kissinger and Johnson just decided they were going to save face. They didn't care how many kids died because they weren't going to admit they were wrong. And now we're in the exact same place. There's just no wall that we see going up. But someday we will see that. I'd be interested to know what Jill thinks about Kissinger, too.
You know, I just think he is one of those fascinating Henry Kissinger figures whose influence, even though he's been officially out of power for so long, has never waned. And there are a handful of people like that who the Democrats have their own versions of Henry Kissinger who, you know, once they leave, they're never gone, and they're perceived to be the wise man. That's the role he's playing.
And also, it's funny because this whole period has seemed so Dr. Strangelove, like only Stanley Kubrick could really get it right. And now Kissinger, who that one character in Dr. Strangelove was based on, is back right in the middle of it, advising them what to do and how to keep their balls. So.
Yeah, speak loud.
You mentioned Condi and her role as a tutor to W. Could you give me some ideas about the further depth of their relationship? And I want to cite there was a photograph in the New York Times with one of the events in Europe, and she's in a ball gown, and he's looking at her to the side. And I just wondered if there's a lot more to
The question is there a lot more, quote unquote, to the relationship between Bush and Condi, and whether she's more than just his foreign policy tutor?
Bush himself made a joke about this the other day. He said, I'm reading in the tabloids that Laura's mad about me and Condi. But the funny thing about W is, he's run the most sort of, macho kind of my way or the highway administration in modern history. And yet he's surrounded by all these sort of female nannies that take care of him, these Vestal virgins who, work 14 hours a day just on him. And Condi was his foreign policy coach, and Karen Hughes was his political coach, and Harriet Myers took care of all his personal legal problems, to the point where he was almost blinded to think that made her qualified for the Supreme Court just because she took care of his legal problems. It didn't matter that she had no constitutional law experience. And so it's just funny that on the one hand he has this very macho administration, but on the other hand he has this cadre of women who take care of him. And, Condi is just a very interesting case because she did what Brent Scowcroft did to get close to the father. He realized that if he was on the playing fields with the father, if he stuck with him when he went to play golf and do all these, running and this kind of thing, that was a good way to get close to him and ace out the Secretary of State, James Baker. And in the same way, Condi exercised with Bush and watched football with him and was in the gym with him constantly, and that's how she kind of aced out other people. She was just there as his sporting companion and trustworthy foreign policy nanny. And so that was all very clever, but unfortunately it didn't give her much time to be reading those terrorist reports that were coming in about bin Laden determined to strike inside the United States.
Here. Yeah.
All the way in the back.
Women supposedly made up the majority of voters. Why do we keep
vote for the wishful basket cases.
Two-part question. One, if women make up more than half of the voting population, why do we keep electing such emotional basket cases? And the second subset of that is, does Arnold deserve a second term here in California?
I don't know about Arnold. I was trying to get an interview with him this week, and it didn't quite work out. So I haven't been able to. I did do some interviews with him during the campaign. I'd have to do some further studying on how he's doing. You'd have to tell me. But it's interesting. I have a chapter in the book about, they never thought women could hold high office because we would be too hormonally, volatile. But, I joke that at least women are only, hormonal once a month. Dick Cheney has raging hormones every day.
Yeah, the man in orange shirt.
He's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. Out here.
But, managing editor, columnist, I didn't see any daylight between them. Everything you said, it sounds, to use a male chauvinist term, pretty clubby.
I guess I don't hear a question in that. Is the question, are we too clubby, or yes? It's a good question. The question is there, I'm managing editor of the Times, which is the news side. Maureen is a columnist and works on the side of the divide that we actually in journalism pay a lot of attention to as a really serious thing. Maureen is of the opinion side, though when we first met each other and became friends, we were both news reporters in Washington. But there is a very real difference between us because, the Times is perceived and often described as a liberal newspaper, but that is really a perception mostly derived from its editorial board and the editorials that we run. And more of the columnists, William Safire was long the conservative columnist voice at the paper, and now David Brooks and John Tierney, who has a libertarian kind of streak, are certainly would not be described as liberals. But Maureen and I are good friends and are here together, but I think that there is a very real difference in the journalism that we do. And I think back to the question about the reality-based community, that it is really important if you're doing searching news side journalism that you try to talk to people on all sides of an issue, not so that you can frame a news story as one side says this, the other says contradictory things, but because news journalists should always be challenging their assumptions and trying to test out whether the facts are really the facts. And the role of a columnist is very different. And I'm here just really playing the role of interpreter and echoing your questions, but am usually pretty careful when I make public appearances to really leave opinion on a different side of a wall because I'm a news person, and I don't know if Maureen has amplification on that.
Yeah, no, actually, it's funny because I think with women, you always think that they're going to do everything together. They're going to go to the bathroom together and they're going to have opinions together. But actually, on all the major things that have come up that have been kind of controversial columns of mine, we've been on opposite sides of how I should handle it. And I guess after 10 years, for better or worse, I don't really need instruction, on what to think or how to do the column. But it's funny because it just as an example of how things are different for women, New York Magazine had a profile of Bill Keller, our executive editor, the other day, and it mentioned that when Jill first got to the Times and the Washington Bureau, she made friends with other powerful women. And I was thinking, if you flip that sentence around and did it about men, it would be meaningless. It would be, of course, any man who goes to his organization makes friends with men. But with women, there's always that little, and then the next sentence was, they represent a liberal occult cabal. Jill and I. And so I wrote the writer of the piece email, and I said, Joe, why didn't you just use the C word that you really wanted to use? Coven. And I just think when women, they think that women are conspiring and they're thinking together and they're, doing everything alike. But it's not true. And my column isn't even a partisan column. It's just very, I would say, Shakespearean. I mean, I grew up in Washington. I can see that the White House power can be poisonous and your ego gets out of control. And that's what you'll see when you read the Woodward book, that everyone, people like Colin Powell and Tennant, who should have been able to march into his office and tell him the truth about how they felt, didn't do it in any real time that could have helped on the war. And it just creates an atmosphere of tone deafness sometimes and power poisoning. And that's what interests me, and that's what I try to point out.
Maureen, there's a very patient woman here in the black.
As a follow-up, could you comment on the job the press has done over the past 6 years?
The press, is she saying?
Yeah. What was the question again?
How's the press
Could you comment on the job that the press has done over the past 6 years?
You hear it?
Yeah, the question is, how good a job does Maureen think the press broadly has done over the past 6 years?
I think the press was very cowed after 9/11 and was not tough enough in most cases, but it was across the board, I think. But again, this comes back to the earlier question. I think it's very tough when you're being accused of not being patriotic. And Bush, even this week, you are taking enemy propaganda if you criticize him. It's enemy propaganda. You are hurting our troops. And I think, journalists are citizens and we want the best for the country. And after 9/11, we were all hurting together. And I think it just took the press a while to pull out of that idea that if you criticized the White House, that you were unpatriotic. I think that's the greatest form of patriotism.
Two more questions.
Okay. The gentleman
There's a question from Colonel Carlson here.
These are both men who ran away from the sound of the guns. 5 deferments. Bush qualified an aircraft that was not going to go to Vietnam, and he knew that. He got in a Champagne unit. They're totally insensitive to death and dying and suffering. Would you please reflect on that?
This is a question from Colonel Vern Carlson, who was G2 and Chief of Intelligence in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam.
The question is how the country should feel about the fact that the people directing the war in Iraq have very limited military experience themselves.
I think this is one of, in an earlier Woodward book, there's a heartbreaking passage where he's clearly channeling Colin Powell. Powell, who's a pal of Woodward's, is clearly the source. And before the Iraq War, Powell is thinking to himself, these guys, who are making this decision have never been at war, none of them. Rummy was in the service but wasn't at war, and I'm the one who's been at war, and I'm the one who knows what these kids are going to go through and sacrifice, and they don't know this. But he did not take it, and that's why I think he was really, it's such a sad kind of Faustian tale with Colin Powell, who might have been president, that at that moment he did not take it to the max. It's the central kind of dynamic of the David Hare play. Stuff happens. And he should have just gone into Bush and unloaded and said how he really felt about this, but he didn't. He pulled back. And you see him as a very diminished figure in this new Woodward book, when Andy Card actually comes in, and also in a new Karen DeYoung book that says he was fired by Bush. And they rolled over him, used him to go to the UN and make this speech with a lot of junk in it, even though he tried to vet it. A friend of his told me that it was, when he got it from Cheney's office, it was a 2.5-hour speech full of not true stuff. And he and Tennant stayed up all night, and he thought he had gotten all the untrue stuff out, but he hadn't. It was just infected with untruth. So they used Colin Powell, who had the highest popularity rating and the most moral standing, and then they tossed him aside. And there's this really sad quote in the Woodward book where he says to Andy Card, well, if I go, Don should have to go too, meaning Rumsfeld. And it's like, he should have made a stand at that moment, because as he said, he was the one who knew what the cost would be in the blood of our kids. And I do think Bush lacks a certain empathy. I just don't think he hasn't gone to one funeral. He has not gone to one memorial service. And he says, well, if you went to one, he'd have to go to more. But think of how many Rudy Giuliani went to after 9/11. When a whole unit like the one in Ohio was blown up, I don't think they want to see it. It isn't part of their reality.
One more question, maybe? From Dick, right here.
The column next to yours today is written by Robert Harris, who warns us that a major attack could produce the kind of authoritarian takeover that happened in ancient Rome.
Yeah.
What they did. From what you know about the character and personality of Bush and about the way they operate, what would be your scenario should there be another attack like that?
Well, I'm not sure how that would go, because on the one hand, it's very discouraging to see what happened with the detainee bill, because it seemed the Democrats are kind of acting like they pushed Bush back, but he seemed to get everything he wanted out of it. There's not going to be habeas corpus. It's not a great testament to American values. So he and Cheney are still able to use national security to get their way. They're having, several victories in the paper today on pushing back checks and balances. But on the other hand, they keep making this remark about how they've saved us from another attack. But to me, that's much more a product of the terrorists operate on their own time. I'm not sure if they care who's president, and when they're ready, they will attack. I don't know how much our attempts to protect the homeland don't seem very, effective to me. So it's hard to say which way that would go. It could go like Katrina, where it could be apparent that they're ineffective. They push themselves as the CEO presidency, and yet they've been completely ineffective. So, but again, I don't know. I think we're in uncharted territory. It's amazing to look back to that kind of halcyon time. That was another thing I was going to say, the woman who asked about Condi. I think the big mistake was Condi and Rummy were very schooled in Cold War, Russian politics, and they were looking at it from the point of terrorism had to be sponsored by a state, and they were just very old-fashioned and not up to date on the fact that terrorism could be this free-floating, parasitic force, and that was another problem. So, and they seem to me still kind of stuck in, we're so reactive, like the liquid gel thing at airports. It's like the terrorists will do something. Growing up, we had Nancy Drew and Bugs Bunny and Henry Fonda and Jimmy Stewart and American Ingenuity, and we just, the world of tomorrow at Disneyland, and you just felt like we were going to be ahead of everything. Our scientists were the best, and now it just seems so reactive and bumbling. And it's just very discouraging. So I'm not sure, and I hope we don't have to find out soon.
Anyway, thank you guys. You were fantastic. Thank you.